The pounding on my front door felt like thunder, shaking me out of the calm Saturday afternoon. I froze. You never forget that sound, the kind of knock that isn't a neighbor saying hello, but an authority demanding you open up. I remember the way my hands trembled as I pulled the curtain back just enough to see the red and blue lights flashing across my driveway. Police at my house, and they weren't here for me. They were here for my son, my teenage boy, 16 years old. With that wide-eyed mix of innocence and defiance, stood frozen in the living room, clutching his phone, pale as a ghost. I could see the fear in his eyes before he even said a word. "Mom, did I do something wrong?" His voice cracked and my heart shattered in that instant. What could I even tell him? How could I explain that in this perfect, quiet suburban neighborhood, the people who were supposed to be our community had just decided he was a threat? The HOA, those self-appointed rulers of every driveway and flower bed, had called the police on my child. For what? For being outside. For existing. For daring to have friends over. I knew I had seconds before that knock turned into something worse. My pulse hammered in my ears as I opened the door, trying to mask the quake in my voice. 2 officers stood there, hands resting just a little too close to their holsters. Behind them, neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, their faces lit up with curiosity and judgment. And in that moment, one thought ran through my head over and over. They're treating my son like a criminal. And they don't even know who's inside this house right now. Because what the HOA didn't realize, what nobody on this street knew, was that my son had friends visiting. Not just any friends. Navy SEALs, real ones. Men who had seen combat. Men who had faced down actual enemies, and now they were about to watch a so-called homeowners association unleash cops on a teenager. But before we got to that shocking moment, I had to survive this one, ma'am, the taller officer said, his voice clipped, rehearsed, like he'd said these words 100 times before. "We've had a call from your homeowners association about disturbances." He glanced past me into the house, eyes landing right on my boy. And just like that, my son wasn't my son anymore. He was a suspect. I could feel my voice rising. Heat boiling in my chest. Disturbances. He's 16. He hasn't done a damn thing wrong. He's in his own home, for God's sake. The officer's jaw clenched, but he didn't move. The second one, younger, shifted uncomfortably, like he knew this was overkill. My son, though, couldn't move at all. He just stood there, wide-eyed, caught between fear and humiliation. While half the neighborhood silently enjoyed the show from behind their blinds, and that's when the weight of it all hit me. The embarrassment, the violation, the fury. They hadn't just called the cops. It branded my boy as a problem, as someone unworthy of safety in his own home. I looked at him, at the way he hugged himself, at the tears he was trying to fight back, and I thought, no, not today. Not my son. But what came next? Oh, that's the part I need you to stay. Because the moment those officers stepped 1 foot closer into my home, the entire story flipped upside down. Asterisk, the silence inside my house was so thick it felt like it could choke you. The taller officer's eyes flicked past me again, scanning the hallway as if he had some right to see more than I was willing to show. My son shifted nervously, and I could feel the way his body was almost pulling back into the wall, like he wanted to disappear. That was when I noticed the smallest sound. Behind me, the scrape of a chair leg, the almost inaudible shuffle of boots on hardwood. My stomach twisted because I knew exactly who was sitting in that living room just 10 feet away. The HOA thought they had called the police to intimidate a teenager, but instead they had just brought uniformed officers into a house where 3 Navy SEALs were sitting, watching it all unfold. I could almost feel their presence without turning the quiet, steady calm of men who didn't flinch at chaos. They weren't saying anything yet, but I knew they were watching every detail, reading every movement, cataloging every threat. To them, this wasn't just drama in a neighborhood cul-de-sac. This was a confrontation, and that thought alone kept my heart racing even faster. The younger officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we've received reports of gatherings, loud noises, possibly underage activity." His voice was softer, almost apologetic, but the words were still like a slap across my face. Underage activity? I snapped. 16? He's in his own house? His biggest crime was probably laughing too loudly with his friends. My hands shook, but my voice didn't. Not this time, because now, it wasn't just about defending my son from nosy neighbors. It was about standing my ground in front of men with badges who thought they had the right to intimidate him. My son's lips trembled. He spoke up, his voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't do anything. The way he said it gutted me. There was no defiance, no teenage attitude. Just raw, terrified honesty. The older officer exhaled, sharp and impatient. And for a split second, I saw it in his eyes. The assumption that my son was guilty of something, that's what broke me. That's what made my voice rise. Look around. I gestured to the quiet street, the trimmed lawns, the suffocating neatness that the HOA worshipped. This is what they called you for? Because a boy was home with his friends? Do you have any idea what it does to a kid to see squad cars outside his door? To be treated like a criminal in front of the entire neighborhood? I could feel my throat tighten, tears threatening, but I refused to let them fall. I wasn't going to cry, not in front of these men. And then, movement. One of the SEALs, tall, broad-shouldered, with that unmistakable bearing of someone who'd seen things most of us couldn't even imagine, stood up from the couch. Slowly, calmly, not aggressive, but with a presence that filled the room like a shadow. The officers noticed instantly. Their posture shifted, hands subtly closer to their belts, eyes narrowing. They didn't know who he was yet. They just saw a man who looked like he could bend steel without breaking a sweat. Is there a problem here? His voice was deep. Steady, like gravel sliding across stone. The room froze. My son's eyes widened, darting between the cop and the man he knew only as Uncle Jake, a family friend. Dunk. But Uncle Jake wasn't just a friend. He was a decorated Navy SEAL, and he hadn't moved a muscle until now. The older officer stiffened. His authority suddenly rattled. Sir, this doesn't concern you, but Jake didn't blink. Didn't flinch. He just took one slow step forward, his gaze never leaving the officer's face. In that moment, I swear you could feel the entire balance of power shift. My son clung to my arm, his fingers digging into my sleeve, and I whispered to him, "It's okay. Just watch." Because what the HOA had unleashed wasn't just humiliation for my family. They had accidentally walked straight into a storm they couldn't control. And I promise you, what happened next is something I will never forget for. As long as I live, the air in my living room felt like it had been cut with a blade, sharp, tense, and heavy. Jake stood there, steady as stone, his shoulders squared. His voice calm, but carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken battles. The officers stiffened, and I could tell from the flicker in their eyes that they suddenly realized this wasn't going to be the easy show of power they had expected. The younger cop shifted nervously, his hand twitching near his belt, while the older one doubled down, raising his voice just a little too loud, like volume could cover the unease in his chest. "Sir, I need you to sit down. This is between us and the boy." Jake didn't move. He didn't sit. He didn't even blink. He took one slow step forward, his boots making the faintest thud against the hardwood. "This boy," he said, voice low and steady, "is under my watch right now. And I need you to understand, you're standing in his home, accusing him of things he hasn't done. Because some HOA board members decided their pride was more important than his dignity. The silence that followed was suffocating. My son's breathing was ragged, fast, like he was trying to take in more air than his lungs would allow. He clutched at my arm tighter, whispering, "Mom." But his voice was swallowed by the thick tension. The older officer snapped back, his words biting, his ego flaring. "Sir, you're obstructing an investigation. I suggest you back down." Before what? He didn't even finish the sentence, because Jake took another step forward. That's when the other two men, the ones who had been sitting silently in my living room, watching everything unfold, finally stood. Up, 3 of them. 3 Navy SEALs. Not in uniform, not with weapons. Just in casual clothes, looking like ordinary men. Until you looked closer, till you saw the way they carried themselves, the way their eyes didn't miss a single detail, the way the room seemed to bend around them, and suddenly the cops weren't looking at a frightened 16-year-old boy. anymore. They were staring at three combat-hardened warriors who had spent their lives standing between chaos and safety. The younger officer swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His fingers twitched, but his voice cracked as he tried to steady it. Who exactly are you guys? Jake didn't answer directly. He didn't need to. He just let the silence hang, thick and powerful, before finally speaking. We're friends of the family, and we don't appreciate intimidation tactics against kids. The older cop opened his mouth again. I could see it, the way his bravado was shrinking, the way the weight of the moment pressed against him. He glanced at his partner, then at the blinds shifting from the houses across the street, dozens of eyes feasting on the drama. And in that moment he knew this wasn't his stage anymore. I took a step forward myself, fueled by something that felt like fire in my veins. You came here because the HOA told you lies. You came here because they wanted to humiliate my son. Well, congratulations, you did. The whole neighborhood saw. But you don't get to destroy his spirit. Not today. My voice cracked at the end, but I didn't care. The tears I had held back finally burned my eyes, but I let them fall. Because I wanted my son to see me fight for him. I wanted him to know that no matter what badges stood at our door, no matter how loud the HOA screamed, his mother would never let him stand alone. The younger officer shifted back a step, certainty written all over his face. The older one gave a sharp exhale, like he was trying to reel himself in, then muttered something about just doing our job. And then, without another word, he motioned to his partner, turned, and walked out the door. The flashing lights faded from my driveway. The neighbors' blinds slowly closed, like they were ashamed to be caught staring. And inside my house, the silence left behind was almost unbearable. My son broke first. He collapsed into my arms, shoulders shaking, his voice muffled into, "My shirt, Mom. I thought they were going to arrest me." I held him tighter, my own tears falling freely now. "I know, baby, I know." Jake put a hand on my shoulder, steady, grounding. He didn't say anything, he didn't need to. But in that touch, I felt the strength of someone who had seen storms bigger than this one, who had stood in the fire and walked out unburned. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because the HOA hadn't just humiliated my son, it poked a hornet's nest they didn't even know existed. It dragged police into my home without realizing who was watching, who was listening, who was ready to push back. And trust me, in the days that followed, the neighborhood learned a lesson they would never, ever forget. So don't go anywhere, because what happened next? That's where the real story begins. Asterisk, the red and blue lights had barely faded from my driveway when the whispers began. You'd think people would have the decency to give us space after what just happened, but no. This neighborhood thrives on gossip the way plants thrive on sunlight. Curtains swayed, phone calls started, and within an hour, I knew the HOA board would be meeting not to apologize, but to justify what they'd done. I sat at the kitchen table, my son upstairs in his room. The silence of his door shut tighter than I'd ever heard before. He didn't want to talk. He didn't even want dinner, just wanted to disappear. And the part that broke me the most, he thought it was his fault, that somehow he'd brought this humiliation on himself. Jake and the other two SEALs sat with me. They didn't talk much. Men like them never fill the air with useless words. They just sat there, calm, watchful, like the storm hadn't passed at all, like it was still brewing in the distance. Finally, Jake leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "They'll come back," he said. I blinked at him, my breath catching. "The police?" "No," he shook his head. "The HOA. People like that. They don't stop when they think they've won. They stop when someone shows them where the line is. And right now, I think there is no line." I shivered because I knew he was right. This wasn't over. Not even close. Sure enough, the very next morning, a letter was taped to my door. The kind of letter only an HOA could write, dripping with self-righteousness, full of accusations dressed up as concerns. They accused my son of being a disturbance to the peace, bringing dangerous individuals into the community. And the part that made me laugh out loud in disbelief of creating a threatening environment for neighbors. Dangerous individuals. They had no idea who they were talking about. I stormed back into the house with that letter clenched in my fist, my voice breaking as I read it aloud. They called you dangerous, I said to Jake, my throat raw. After you defended my son from humiliation, they dare. Jake lifted his hand, silencing me gently. His expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened just slightly. If that's the game they want to play, he said softly, then we'll play, but on our terms. The other SEALs nodded, the kind of nod that carries weight that makes you realize you're not just dealing with friends here. You're dealing with men who have spent their lives calculating moves, anticipating enemies, dismantling threats, and now their focus was on an HOA board that thought power came from clipboards and bylaws. Still, I couldn't shake the fear. They're just neighbors, I whispered, though the words felt hollow even as they left my lips. We can't fight them like you don't have to fight them, Jake said. You just have to let them show who they really are. Trust me, they'll do it. That's exactly what happened. By noon, word had spread through the entire neighborhood. People I'd known for years, people who had smiled at me at block parties, waved when I walked my dog, were suddenly keeping their distance. Some didn't even look at me when I passed, and the ones who did, their eyes were sharp with judgment, as if my family was suddenly dangerous, reckless. The kind of people you whisper about but never confront directly. It should have broken me. It should have made me retreat, but instead, it lit a fire in me I didn't know I had. Because if the HOA wanted a war, then maybe, just maybe, they had chosen the wrong family to pick on. And I'll tell you this, by the end of the week, the whole neighborhood would see exactly what happens when you push too far. Stay with me. Because what came next wasn't just petty letters or gossip, it was a showdown. And it wasn't the HOA that ended up in control. By midweek, the HOA had gone from whispers to full-on attacks. Letters weren't enough anymore. Now they were sending notices with bold red stamps across the top. Violation. Violation for the cars in my driveway. Violation for my son's friends. Loitering. Violation for creating an unsafe environment. Every word felt like poison. They weren't just targeting me anymore. They were painting my son as some kind of danger. A boy who played basketball in the driveway. Who laughed with his friends. Who had never even skipped a day of school. The weight of it all sat heavy on me, pressing down every time I checked the mailbox. Every time I heard the click of an email notification from the HOA board, my son stopped leaving the house. He wouldn't even step onto the porch, convinced the moment he did, another letter, another phone call, another cop car would come crawling down our street. And the worst part, that's exactly what the HOA wanted. They wanted him invisible. Silenced, ashamed, I sat at the kitchen table with another letter in my hand, shaking with anger when Jake leaned over and read it silently. His expression never changed. When he set it down, his words cut through the quiet like steel. They're not trying to enforce rules anymore, he said. They're trying to break you, and if they think intimidation will work here, they've picked the wrong house. The other SEALs nodded in agreement. One of them, Mark, broad and quiet, with eyes that seemed to see right through people, leaned forward. You ever notice bullies don't know what to do when someone doesn't play by their script? I frowned, clutching the letter tighter. What do you mean? They push, Mark said simply. They push and push, because most people cave. Most people fold to the pressure. But when someone pushes back, really pushes back, that's when their cracks start showing, and that's when it clicked. These men weren't just sitting here as silent witnesses. They were strategists, warriors. They weren't going to let an HOA of all things destroy a teenager's spirit that night. I heard them talking in the living room while my son slept upstairs. Their voices were low, but I caught fragments. Words like documentation, words like patterns, words like pressure points. They weren't planning violence. They weren't threatening revenge. What they were doing was so much more terrifying to an HOA. They were planning to expose them. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Jake at the door, speaking calmly to one of the HOA board members who had come to follow up. Only this wasn't a normal conversation. Jake wasn't defensive. He wasn't apologetic. He was precise. He asked questions that cut like a scalpel. Can you show me which bylaw this supposed violation falls under? Do you have documented evidence of these claims? Was there a board vote, or is this a personal complaint? The board member stammered, caught off guard, because bullies don't expect to be questioned. They expect fear, they expect compliance. And in that moment, watching Jake dismantle him, with nothing but calm, pointed questions, I realized something that made my chest swell with pride and relief. The HOA had power over people like me, regular homeowners who just wanted peace, but against men like these, men who had faced down corruption, lies, and real enemies, the HOA's power was nothing but paper and noise. Still, I wasn't naive. I knew this battle wasn't going to end with one uncomfortable conversation. And I was right, because that evening, another letter arrived. This one wasn't just a violation notice. This one was a summons. They wanted me and my son to appear before the HOA board, a tribunal, they called it. My hands shook as I read the words, tribunal, like we were criminals, like my boy was on trial. I crumpled the letter in my fist, anger flooding every vein. They think they can drag him in front of the neighborhood, humiliate him again. I whispered through clenched teeth. Jake took the paper from me, smoothed it out, and studied it. Then, without looking up, he said 6 words that sent a shiver down my spine. Then we'll go to the tribunal. He finally raised his eyes too. Mine, calm, unshaken, and we'll make sure they never forget it. I didn't know exactly what he meant, right? But deep down, I trusted him, trusted them. Because if there was one thing I had learned in the past few days, it was this. Navy SEALs. Don't show up to lose, and trust me. That so-called tribunal turned out to be nothing like what the HOA expected. Asterisk, the night of the tribunal felt heavier than any courtroom I'd ever imagined. The HOA had staged it inside the community hall, a bland room with fluorescent lights, buzzing overhead, folding chairs lined in rows, and a cheap podium at the front. But to them, this was their arena. Their chance to prove they were the untouchable rulers of our neighborhood. The board sat behind a long table, 3 of them stiff, with self-importance, their clipboards stacked high with papers. Behind them, a banner that read Community Integrity First. I almost laughed at the irony if I hadn't been so furious. Neighbors filled the rows, whispering, their eyes darting between us and the board. Some looked curious, others gleeful, like they couldn't wait for the spectacle to begin. And in the middle of it all sat my son, shoulders hunched, his hands twisting in his lap. He looked so small, so out of place, like a lamb being led straight into the wolves' den. I sat beside him, holding his hand. But we weren't alone. Jake and the other SEALs sat just a row behind us, silent, watchful. They weren't there to make a scene. They were there to be seen. And already they were. People noticed the way they carried themselves. Not loud, not aggressive, but unshakable. The chairwoman of the HOA, a sharp-eyed woman named Linda, who wore power like cheap. Perfume cleared her throat into the microphone. We are here tonight to address the repeated violations of the homeowner at 427 Pine Grove, she announced, her voice dripping with authority. Specifically, her son's behavior, which has been deemed disruptive, unsafe, and a threat to the harmony of our community. A murmur rippled through the room. I squeezed my son's hand tighter, fury burning in my chest. A threat. He was 16. The only thing he threatened was the HOA's fragile sense of control, Linda continued, voice growing bolder with every word. It is the board's responsibility to ensure the safety and comfort of all residents. And when one household repeatedly disregards these standards, decisive action must be taken. This meeting will determine appropriate consequences. Consequences. They said it like they had the weight of the law behind them. But all I heard was bullying. When it was our turn to speak, my voice shook with both fear and rage. My son has done nothing wrong, I said, the microphone picking up the tremor in my throat. You called the police on a child. You humiliated him in front of his neighbors. And now you want to drag him here to shame him again? For what? For existing. Linda leaned back, a smug smile creeping across her face. Mrs., we are simply enforcing rules that apply to everyone. If your son can't behave within the standards of this community, perhaps this is not the right neighborhood for your family. The words cut like a knife. They weren't just threatening my son, they were threatening our home. And that's when Jake stood up. The room went still. The air seemed to thicken as every eye turned toward him. He didn't rush, didn't raise his voice. He simply walked to the front, stood beside me, and fixed his gaze on the board. My name is Jacob, he said calmly, his voice carrying through the hall without needing the microphone. I'm a guest in this home. I've watched the way your board treated a 16-year-old boy as if he were a criminal. Linda tried to interrupt, but Jake's presence alone was enough to drown her out. His eyes never wavered, his words precise. Deliberate. You claim to value safety, he continued, but safety does not come from harassment. Safety does not come from intimidation. Safety comes from fairness, from respect, from knowing that every person, even a child, deserves dignity in their own home. The whispers in the room grew louder now, shifting. Some neighbors leaned forward, nodding. Others looked uncomfortable. The board members stiffened, their confidence cracking. Jake let the silence linger before finishing. I've served in places where real threats exist. I can tell you this, a 16-year-old laughing with his friends in his own driveway is not a threat. The only threat here is the abuse of authority sitting behind that table. It was like a grenade had gone off. Not with sound, but with truth. The room erupted. Neighbors who had been silent started speaking up, murmuring. Agreement, questioning the board's actions. Someone shouted, "He's right." Another asked, "Why did you call the police in the first place?" Linda's face flushed crimson. She banged her hand on the table, trying to regain control. "This is our meeting," she snapped. "We will not be intimidated by," but her words faltered. Because standing beside Jake now were the other two SEALs. Not speaking, not threatening, just standing, united, unmoving, and suddenly the board looked very, very small. My son turned to me, his eyes wide, his voice trembling. "Mom, are they standing up for me?" I held his hand tighter, tears finally spilling down my cheeks. "Yes, baby. They are." And in that moment, I realized something powerful. The HOA had wanted to put my boy on trial. Instead, they had put themselves on display, and the entire neighborhood was watching. What happened after that tribunal? That's where the cracks in their empire really began to show. Trust me, the way the SEALs handled it was nothing short of legendary. Asterisk. The night after that meeting, the air in my neighborhood felt different. It wasn't the same smug silence that usually followed an HOA victory. No, this was heavier, charged, like the ground itself was waiting to crack. People weren't whispering about my son anymore. They were whispering about the board, about the cracks they had just shown when someone finally stood up to them. I saw it in the way neighbors glanced at me the next morning. Not everyone smiled, not everyone nodded, but their eyes had changed. Some looked ashamed, others looked curious. A few even looked relieved, like someone had finally said what they were too afraid to say themselves. But the board? They weren't. Relieved, they were furious. By afternoon, another letter landed on my porch. This one was colder, more vicious than all the rest. Words like insubordination, hostile behavior, and termination of residency jumped out in bold ink. My chest tightened as I read it, not because I believed a word of it, but because it proved something I had always feared. These people would stop at nothing. They wanted me out. They wanted my son gone. And they were willing to burn everything down to get it. I slammed the letter down on the kitchen table, my hands trembling with anger. "They're not just trying to scare us anymore," I said, my voice breaking. "They want us gone. They want to erase us." No, Jake didn't flinch. He picked up the paper, read it slowly, and then folded it neatly before setting it aside. His eyes locked on mine, calm but steady, and for a moment I felt like I was looking at a wall of unshakable strength. "People like this only understand one thing," he said quietly. Exposure. You don't fight them in the dark. You drag them into the light. The other two men nodded, and one of them, David, quiet and sharp, the kind of man whose every word felt deliberate, leaned in. They'd been hiding behind fear. Behind those letters, behind those little meetings, but that fear cuts both ways. Once their neighbors see who they really are, the fear doesn't work anymore. I pressed my palms flat against the table, my chest aching with frustration. And how do we do that? How do we show people the truth when they've already decided we're the villains? Jake's eyes softened, just slightly. You don't have to. They'll do it themselves. And he was right, because that night, the board made their next move. And it wasn't just petty, it was desperate, at exactly 9 p.m. As the streetlights flickered on, and the cicadas buzzed in the heavy summer air, 3 board members marched onto my lawn. Clipboards in hand, cameras strapped around their necks. They didn't knock. They didn't call. They just started taking pictures of my house, of my driveway, of my son's basketball hoop, his bike leaning against the garage, even the potted plants on my porch. I yanked open the door, rage boiling inside me. "What do you think you're doing?" I shouted, my voice carrying into the night. Linda, the chairwoman, turned to me with that same smug smile she had worn at the tribunal. "We're documenting repeated violations," she said smoothly, as if the words gave her some divine authority. "This property is no longer in compliance with community standards." My son, who had been sitting just inside the doorway, stood up, his fists clenched. His voice cracked, but it carried strength I hadn't heard before. "This is my home," he yelled. "You don't get to do this." For a second, Linda actually looked surprised. But then she sneered. "You're a child. Stay in your place." That was the moment Jake stepped forward? He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply walked out onto the porch, his presence enough to silence every word on Linda's tongue. "Put the cameras away," said evenly. The 3 board members froze, shifting uneasily under his gaze. But Linda tried to keep her composure. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. You're not a resident of this neighborhood." Jake's eyes narrowed, and though his tone never changed, there was something in it now. Steel. Finality. A weight that settled over all of us. "It concerns me when grown adults harass a family in the middle of the night. It concerns me when a 16-year-old boy is treated like a criminal for living in his own home. Put the cameras away." The silence that followed was deafening. The 2 men flanking Linda exchanged nervous glances. Their hands shook slightly as they lowered their cameras, suddenly unwilling to press the shutters. Linda, though, held her ground, or tried to. She lifted her chin, her voice shaking but stubborn. "You have no authority here." Jake didn't move. He didn't need to. "Maybe not," he said quietly. "But I've spent my life protecting people from threats far bigger than you. And make no mistake what you're doing right now. This is a threat to this family, to this boy, and it stops here." The street was silent but not empty. Neighbors stood in the shadows, peeking out from behind fences and porch lights, watching the scene unfold. Watching the cracks in the board's armor finally split wide open, and for the first time, saw it, the fear in Linda's eyes, real. Fear, because in that moment, she knew their power wasn't absolute anymore. Linda's face hardened, but her eyes betrayed her. She wasn't used to being challenged, not like this, not in front of her neighbors. And though she tried to hide it, she realized she was no longer in control. Her lips tightened, her clipboard trembled in her grip. And finally, with one sharp motion, she snapped it shut. "Fine," she hissed, her voice low but dripping venom. "But this isn't over." She turned on her heel, heels crunching, against the gravel of my driveway, and the other 2 board members hurried after her, like shadows scrambling to keep up. Their retreat wasn't quick enough, though, because whispers rose from the darkened yards, faint but undeniable. "Did you see that? They were on his lawn, taking pictures of his kids' stuff? It's not right." For the first time, the whispers weren't about us. They were about them. I closed the door slowly, my hands shaking, my chest pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My son dropped onto the couch, still breathing fast, his fists tight at his sides. He wasn't crying, but his jaw was clenched, his face red, his body strung tight like a bowstring. I knelt in front of him, gripping his shoulders. "Hey, look at me. You did nothing wrong. Do you hear me?" Nothing. His eyes darted up to mine, wide, raw. "Then why do they hate me so much?" I whispered. The question sliced through me like a knife. I wanted to tell him the truth, that sometimes people target you not because you've done something wrong, but because you're the one thing they can't control. But the words tangled in my throat. How do you explain that kind of cruelty to a 16-year-old? Before I could answer, Jake crouched beside me. His voice was calm, steady, the kind of tone that carried more weight than 1,000 reassurances. They don't hate you. They fear you. Fear what you represent. They fear a kid who won't bow his head, who stands up for himself even when the odds are stacked against him. It scares people like them more than anything else. Son blinked, his breathing slowing just slightly. And in that moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not relief, not comfort, but strength. A seed of defiance planted deep, beginning to grow. The night didn't end there, though. Around 11 p.m., just as I was finally drifting towards some fragile sleep, my phone buzzed. A message. From a number I didn't recognize. It was a photo of my house, taken from the street. My son's bedroom window glowing faintly from the light. Inside, no words, no explanation, just the picture. My stomach lurched, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't about fines or bylaws anymore. This wasn't about property values. This was intimidation. Pure, calculated intimidation. I stormed into the living room, shoving the phone toward Jake. "Look at this. Look at what they're doing." Now, he studied it for a moment, his jaw tightening. Then without a word, he passed the phone to David, who looked at it with the same cold calculation. Finally, Jake spoke. "They've crossed a line. What do we do?" My voice cracked. I wasn't ashamed of the fear in it, not anymore. I can't protect him from this. They're watching us. They're threatening us. What if Jake held up a hand, steady and controlled? "You've done enough. You fought harder than most would. But from here on, let us handle it." And there was something in the way he said it. Not arrogance, not bluster, but certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from men who had stared down dangers most of us couldn't imagine. I wanted to believe him. I had to believe him. Because the truth was, I didn't know how much longer I could stand alone. The next day, the neighborhood was buzzing. People avoided eye contact. At first, but when they thought no one was looking, they glanced at my house, at my son, at me. Something was shifting. I could feel it. The HOA wasn't the untouchable force they had been the week before, and yet that shift only made them more desperate. By evening, another notice arrived. Not taped to my door this time, not slipped under. The mat. No, it was nailed into the wooden post of my mailbox like some kind of warning sign. Bold black letters sprawled across the top. Final warning, as I ripped it down. My hand shaking with fury, I realized one thing. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was war. And I wasn't sure if the board understood yet, but they had picked the wrong family to start it with. The paper in my hand crumpled under the force of my grip, my pulse pounding so loud I could barely hear my own thoughts. Final warning. The words mocked me, branded across the page like a scarlet letter, daring me to give in, daring me to fold. But something inside me had snapped. I stormed back inside, tossed the notice onto the kitchen table, and for a moment just stared at it. My son picked it up slowly, his eyes tracing the words, his lips tightening. "They won't stop," he whispered. His voice wasn't scared this time. It was bitter, sharp, carrying a weight no 16-year-old should have to carry. "I know," I said quietly, "but they don't know us either. They think they can break us with fear, with threats. They don't understand that fear only makes some people stronger." Jake stepped forward, resting one hand on my shoulder. "You're right. And if they want a war, then they'll get a war. But it won't be the kind they were expecting." The next day was Sunday, a day that usually meant quiet lawns and kids playing basketball in the driveways. But this time, it was different. It started with the sound of cars pulling up. Not police cars this time, but trucks, sedans, a couple of motorcycles. People I didn't recognize at first stepped out, one by one, and my heart skipped a beat. Veterans, friends of Jake and David, men with the same posture, the same calm, watchful eyes. Not in uniform, but carrying themselves in a way you don't mistake once you've seen it. They didn't make a scene, didn't march down the street. They just came into my yard, shook my hand, and stood nearby. Like shadows, like guardians. My neighbors peeked through their curtains, whispers starting again. This time they weren't whispering about how the HOA would crush us. No, they were asking each other, who are these people? By afternoon, Linda showed up. She didn't come. Alone. 3 of her board members followed her, clipboards clutched like weapons. Faces twisted in that smug confidence of people who believe the law bends to their will. She stopped at the edge of my driveway, arms crossed, her smile thin as glass. "So this is your big plan?" she sneered. "Invite strangers into the neighborhood, violate HOA bylaws against group gatherings. You're only digging yourself deeper." Jake stepped forward before I could, his eyes locked on hers, calm but unflinching. "These aren't strangers," he said evenly. "These are men who know the meaning of loyalty, of service, of protecting what matters. Something you wouldn't understand." Her smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, before she snapped back. "This is private property, and the HOA rules are clear." "You are?" David cut her off, his voice low, almost dangerous. "Talk to us about rules. We've spent our lives defending freedoms you've never had to earn. If you think a stack of papers and some made-up fines give you the right to harass this family, you're in for a lesson you won't forget." The board members shuffled uneasily behind her, their bravado slipping, and the neighbors. They were outside now, not hiding behind windows anymore, standing at the ends of their driveways, arms crossed, silent but present, watching, choosing. Sides without saying a word. Linda's eyes darted to them, then back to me. Her voice rose, shrill now, breaking under the pressure. "You can't defy us forever. You'll regret this." And for the first time, I didn't flinch. I didn't feel the sting of her words. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "No. Linda, the only ones who will regret this are the people who thought they could terrorize a family and walk away without consequences." Her face twisted, red with fury, but she had no comeback. None of them did. They turned and stormed off, the sound of their footsteps hollow against the pavement. The veterans didn't cheer, didn't clap. They just stood taller, their presence. Alone enough to remind me I wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time in weeks. As the sun dipped behind the houses and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I felt something I hadn't felt in far too long. Hope, because the fight wasn't over. But neither were we.